For nearly a century, the United States has dominated the global stage, economically, politically, and militarily. With only 4% of the world's population, it has historically produced 20% of global income and commands nearly 40% of the world's total military spending. But the era of unchallenged American supremacy may be nearing its end. A new challenger emerges by 2028. China is expected to overtake the US as the world's largest economy. For decades, China has methodically positioned itself to shape a new world order, investing more than $1 trillion since 2010 in developing nations to forge strategic partnerships. While Washington focused on short-term gains and political infighting, Beijing played a long game of economic diplomacy. The American-led global order appears increasingly fragile. U.S. government debt has ballooned to $36 trillion, with interest, payments alone consuming 1/6 of the federal budget. Globalization, once a cornerstone of U.S. influence, is now being unraveled amid tariffs, trade wars, and erratic foreign policies. Echoes of empire, history repeats itself, empires fall. From the Romans to the British to the Dutch, every dominant power has eventually ceded its place in history. Their downfalls weren't always dramatic, but slow declines marked by overextension, debt, complacency, and loss of public trust. The United States may now be following the same trajectory. The U.S. consumer culture, heavily reliant on debt, has reached unsustainable levels. From $1.8 trillion in 2000, U.S. consumer debt has soared past $5 trillion in 2020. More Americans live paycheck to paycheck than ever before. Meanwhile, the federal government is projected to reach $54 trillion in debt by 2034, averaging $150,000 per citizen. The economic over-reliance on foreign manufacturing, especially from China, is also glaring. An estimated 97% of laptops and 78% of smartphones sold in the U.S. are made in China. From toys to sports gear to electronics, the U.S. has become deeply dependent on its greatest geopolitical rival. The rise of China, quiet, steady, strategic, while the U.S. celebrated the fall of the Soviet Union and the global spread of capitalism. In the 1990s, China was laying the groundwork for an economic transformation. What Washington perceived as China's embrace of capitalism and democracy was actually a shrewd strategy to enter, then reshape, the global system from within. Between 1990 and 2020, Chinese manufacturing output grew from $100 billion to nearly $5 trillion, a 50-fold increase. The nation became the world's factory, not only making consumer products, but also investing heavily in high-tech sectors and critical infrastructure. Unlike Western consumption-driven economies, where 70% of GDP in the US and 65% in the UK is based on consumer spending, China's economy is powered by savings and investment. Only 39% of its GDP goes toward consumption. This has allowed China to build vast reserves, funding ambitious projects like high-speed rail networks, green energy initiatives, and next-gen semiconductor manufacturing. By the end of 2023, household savings in China had reached $19.1 trillion, averaging around $57,000 per person. These savings aren't just being reinvested domestically. China is using them to extend influence globally, reshaping trade routes, infrastructure, and diplomatic alliances through projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, a tipping point. As the American political system grows more divided and distracted, the deeper question remains: has the U.S. already passed the point of no return? The symptoms of decline are eerily familiar: ballooning debt, widening inequality, unstable governance, and waning international credibility. Simultaneously, China's rise is following a well-trodden path of previous empires: economic boom, global investment, and soft power expansion. At the core of China's global strategy lies the Belt and Road Initiative. Since its launch in 2013, China has invested over $1.3 trillion in building ports, railways, and power plants across developing nations. Today, this ambitious project spans more than 150 countries, reaching into Europe and impacting over 75% of the world's population. A major focus has been Africa, a region projected to make up 25% of the global population by 2050. In just the past decade, China has financed over 12,000 kilometers of roads, built more than 20 ports, and constructed 80 power facilities across the continent. In comparison, the United States' development efforts pale. Its counterpart agency, USAID, has managed to build just 800 kilometers of road in the last 30 years, a staggering 15 times less than China. Instead of focusing on development, U.S. foreign policy has largely revolved around military intervention. Since the early 2000s, the U.S. has been involved in over 72 foreign conflicts, including the invasion of Iraq, which cost $2.2 trillion and left behind little measurable success after nearly a decade of warfare. For decades, the U.S. positioned itself as the world's policeman, spreading democracy and capitalism, often through force. In contrast, China has pursued a fundamentally different approach. It doesn't aim to reshape governments or impose its political system. Its goal is singular: expand its influence. Surprisingly, this doesn't involve more conflict, but often less. China prefers cooperation over control, forming partnerships with countries regardless of their ideologies, values, or political systems. While the U.S. tries to remake other nations in its own image, China is content to work with them as they are. Now, we're witnessing a clash of two global ideologies, and it appears China is gaining ground. In 2023, for the first time in history, China's approval rating in Africa surpassed that of the United States. Meanwhile, America's global influence is beginning to wane, struggling to compete with the efficiency and consistency of China's development strategy. But this power shift isn't only happening abroad. There's been a slow, silent force eating away at the U.S. economy for decades: deindustrialization. In the early 1960s, manufacturing jobs made up 30% of U.S. employment. By 2020, that number had dropped to just 8%. As global trade barriers fell, American companies sought cheaper labor overseas, chasing profits over domestic resilience. It started quietly. Textile mills in the South shut down. Steel towns like Pittsburgh and Youngstown closed their factories. But soon, what began as a trickle turned into a mass exodus. America's once mighty industrial engine, the bedrock of its post-war prosperity, began to vanish. These jobs had provided stability, good wages, and a path to upward mobility for millions. Without them, many Americans were left behind in a new economy that valued capital, technology, and finance, but not manual labor. Now you might wonder, does this really matter, especially when the U.S. economy has more than doubled in size since the 1980s? On paper, it sounds like a success story, but GDP growth doesn't tell us who is benefiting. While averages show rising wealth, the majority of Americans haven't seen meaningful improvements. That's because most of the gains have gone to the top earners. Since the 1970s, the share of income going to the middle and lower classes has fallen, while the top 1% has expanded its wealth significantly. Today, that top 1% owns over 30% of the nation's wealth, up from 22% in the early 2000s. Meanwhile, the bottom income bracket has seen virtually no growth, with average incomes hovering around $28,000 per year. Worse yet, more Americans now fall into this lower bracket, rising from 25% to nearly 30% of the population. And the economic pressures haven't stopped there. In the past 40 years, housing prices have skyrocketed. A home that cost $60,000 in the 1980s now sells for over $400,000, a 500% increase, while incomes for the poor have remained stagnant. The result is widespread disillusionment. Many feel the American dream, the belief that hard work leads to success, is slipping away. People feel their institutions have failed them, and their calls for radical change have only grown louder. In 2024, those frustrations reached a boiling point. Donald Trump won in a landslide victory, promising to take America back to its golden age. His main strategy boiled down to one word: tariffs. The idea was simple: tax imports to force companies to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. This would revive industry and, as a bonus, generate $1.8 trillion in revenue over a decade. On paper, it seemed like a solid plan, but within just 10 days, most of the tariffs were rolled back. Why? Because the global economy is built on free trade and interconnected supply chains, a system the US itself designed. Suddenly, reversing course triggered panic in the bond market, which underpins US government finances. Here's the risk. If investors lose confidence and start selling US Treasury bonds, interest rates spike. And with the government owing $33 trillion, even a 1% increase in rates adds $300 billion in annual interest payments. That kind of shift could turn today's fiscal problems into a full-blown crisis. More than just a policy misstep, the tariff debacle resembled the reactionary decline of empires past. Like Rome or Britain, dominant powers often lash out when their influence fades, resorting to isolation, taxes, or protectionism in a desperate attempt to hold on. So where does this leave the American world order? For decades, US dominance felt unshakable. But now cracks are showing. Rising inequality, massive debt, and internal division are weakening the very foundations of American power. Meanwhile, China is methodically playing the long game. While America borrowed to consume, China saved to invest. It has built the infrastructure and industries that will shape the future. The contrast couldn't be more stark. Short-term thinking versus long-term planning, debt versus investment, conflict versus cooperation.